He pinned a medal on my chest, smiled for the cameras, and said, "My daughter is a hero." But minutes later, I heard him tell a general outside my hospital door, "She's not a hero, she's a broken mind in a uniform. We should have let her die out there. It would have saved us the embarrassment." That moment shattered everything. So I made a promise, right there in that hospital bed. If they wanted me silent, I'd make sure the world heard every truth they tried to bury. My name is Greta Laird. I'm 33 years old, a lieutenant in the United States Navy, and as of this morning, a recipient of the Purple Heart. I was trained to stand tall, to salute with precision, and to never show weakness, at least not where it could be seen. But that morning, I sat in a wheelchair, trapped in a body that didn't move the way it used to, cloaked in a uniform that felt more like a costume than armor. The crisp wool rubbed against fresh scar tissue, long angry lines crisscrossing my back like a map no one dared to read. My skin burned with each movement. Every thread screamed against the trauma it tried to contain. Flashbulbs flickered in rapid succession, echoing the chaos of an ambush. My eyes winced involuntarily. Cameras lined the room like a gauntlet, their lenses cold and hungry, waiting for the perfect frame. The injured war hero, decorated and obedient. General Harris stepped forward, a mannequin of military prestige. His medals gleamed, his smile didn't reach his eyes. He pinned the Purple Heart to my chest with an ease that made me wonder how many times he'd done it before. "Lieutenant Laird," he said into the microphones, "a woman of valor, an inspiration to us all." I heard the words, but they slid past me like oil on water. They weren't meant for me. They were meant for the press, for the narrative, for the people watching at home who needed to believe everything was under control. My father stood beside him, Colonel Daniel Laird, impeccably dressed, stoic, his jaw carved from stone, his posture textbook perfect. He looked at me like a commanding officer reviews a formation, not like a father looking at his daughter. I searched his face for something, anything, but found only distance. No one mentioned the nerve damage, or the chronic insomnia, or the heat of burning metal on skin. No one mentioned Ruiz or Hartley, or the moment the Orion guidance system failed and left us exposed in hostile terrain. That truth was too messy for the evening news. They needed a clean story, and I was it. I tried to smile. The effort hurt more than I expected. Painkillers turned to sludge in my throat. I swallowed anyway. Someone clapped, a camera clicked, a nurse wiped a tear from her eye. I wished I felt worthy of any of it. After the ceremony, the crowd filtered out in polite murmurs, heels clicking on the polished tile. I remained behind, still in uniform, still in pain, my body sinking into the chair as though it wanted to disappear into the linoleum. The door hadn't closed all the way. Through the sliver, I heard my father's voice. "She's not stable," he said to General Harris, calm, even. "The trauma, she's not thinking clearly. She's seeing things that aren't there. I'm proud of her service, of course, but she's becoming a liability. To the Corps, to the mission. We need to be pragmatic." My lungs stopped moving. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. A cold, dull throb pulsed behind my temples. Liability. Not hero, not survivor, not daughter, just a burden. I gripped the armrest of the wheelchair. The vinyl creaked beneath my fingers. Heat rushed up my neck, flushing my face. My stomach clenched with something deeper than betrayal. It was erasure. He was rewriting me in real time, undoing everything I had endured, everything I had survived, with a few strategic sentences. He knew I'd hear him. He wanted me to. He stepped into the room moments later. The same man who taught me to tie combat boots, to clean a rifle, to salute with precision, walked toward me like I was another soldier needing discipline. His face betrayed nothing. No apology, no regret, just mechanical concern. He straightened the blanket over my legs. "Rest, Lieutenant," he said. His tone was clipped, cold. "Don't overthink. Recovery is your mission now. Let command worry about the rest. Let command bury it. Let command twist it. Let me vanish into silence." I wanted to scream, to throw the medal back in his face, to ask him how he could trade his daughter for a spotless record, for the illusion of order, but I didn't, because screaming would prove his point. So I sat still, silent, the tears on my face betraying the war raging inside me. The metal on my chest felt like a branding iron. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, not from weakness, but from restraint. I pressed against the cool metal, wondering how many others had worn one just like it. How many of them had felt this hollow. Outside, the hallway had gone quiet, but inside me his words rang out. "She's not stable. She's imagining conspiracies. She's a liability." I had faced enemy fire. I had pulled wounded from burning wreckage. I had screamed into radios that didn't work while blood soaked through my gloves. I had done everything they trained me to do, but nothing prepared me for this, for betrayal in khaki and polished shoes. That was the day I realized the real battlefield wasn't over there. It was here, in this room, in the voice of my father. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which war would be harder to survive. The bandages came off slowly, the adhesive pulling at my skin in small, bitter tugs. The nurse was careful, but it didn't matter. The scars didn't hurt like they used to. They'd become part of me, raised, angry lines like rivers carved by fire. She whispered something kind as she redressed the wound, but I barely heard her. Because in my head, the whisper of my father still echoed, "She's not stable." My gaze dropped to the floor, and like a slow undertow, the memory dragged me under. I remember the day I graduated from the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The sky was an impossible shade of blue, and the sun beat down on the rows of uniforms like a spotlight. It should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. I had bled, wept, and clawed my way through every test, every doubt cast at me, not just because I was a woman, but because I was Daniel Laird's daughter. My father stood waiting on the field, his posture as straight as the dress blues he wore. When I approached, he shook my hand, a firm, professional squeeze, and said, "Good, don't shame the Laird name." That was it. No smile, no hug, no "I'm proud of you." Just an order wrapped in a warning. Later that evening, at the graduation reception, I spotted him across the room with one of his old Navy buddies. They were laughing, arms draped over the shoulders of a young male graduate, his friend's son. "This one," my father said, his voice loud with admiration. "He's the future of the Navy." I stood nearby, my diploma in hand, still crisp from the folder. The laughter stung more than any insult. I had survived Annapolis, 4 years of being underestimated, of hearing that women didn't belong on ships or in strategy rooms. I had endured it all, believing that maybe, just maybe, the finish line would earn me his respect. It didn't. But not everyone saw me through his lens. Professor Callahan did. He was older, with a shock of silver hair and a voice like worn leather, warm, steady. He taught military history, and his office smelled like aged paper and burnt coffee. It was a refuge I hadn't expected. One afternoon, he called me in after class. "Lieutenant Laird," he said, leaning forward over a battered desk. "You have the eyes of a strategist, not a foot soldier. Don't let anyone, especially not your father, convince you otherwise." I froze. No one ever talked about my father that way, certainly not with that blend of defiance and compassion. He handed me a book, ancient and frayed, about Queen Boudica, a warrior who led a rebellion against the Romans. "Courage takes many forms," he said. "Sometimes it's charging into battle. Sometimes it's standing your ground in a room full of men who think you're less." His words lit something in me, not fire, more like a compass needle settling for the first time. That evening, I sat in my dorm room, running my fingers along the cracked leather spine of the book. For the first time, I felt like someone saw me, not as a daughter or a token, but as a leader in my own right. I carried that book through every deployment. It stayed tucked in my gear bag, even after pages began to fall out. It was my quiet defiance, my reminder. Years later, after deployments and medals and scars earned in sand and steel, I came home for Thanksgiving. The house was exactly the same: white siding, red brick chimney, a flag out front that never once touched the ground. Inside, the table was set with fine china, and the familiar smells of roast turkey, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce filled the air. I sat next to my older brother, Andrew, an investment advisor with perfect hair and a smug laugh. He dominated the conversation with stories of a client acquisition and something about tax optimization. My father nodded in approval, his eyes twinkling with pride. When there was a lull, I spoke up. "We just completed a high-level joint training exercise in the Pacific." I was leading the logistics planning, pretty complex theater movement. Before I could finish, he cut me off. "Eat, we don't talk work at the dinner table." His words fell like a gavel. Silence stretched like an elastic band across the room. Even Andrew shut up. I looked down at my plate, heart pounding. A moment later, my mother reached over and quietly placed the best cut of turkey breast on my plate. She didn't look at me, but her fingers lingered on the fork. It was a soft, wordless apology, a small act of defiance. I chewed slowly, my throat dry. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I realized something cold and heavy. I could strategize entire battalions, anticipate enemy movements, survive ambushes, and lead men twice my size into live-fire zones. But I could never win at that table. Not with him. Not in that house. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning above me that night, listening to its soft whir as if it could drown out the silence pressing against my chest. Every corner of that house whispered of comparison. Awards I didn't win, standards I couldn't meet, silences I was expected to accept. My father's shadow didn't fall over me, it swallowed me whole. I realized then, it was never about being better or stronger. It was about never being enough for the one man whose approval I'd been chasing my entire life. That ache, that gap, had shaped every decision I ever made in uniform, and it still hurt, deeper than any scar on my body. The physical therapy room at Walter Reed smelled like antiseptic and old sweat, clean but never comforting. Metal bars lined the walls, mirrors too. Every time I looked up, I saw a woman I barely recognized, thin, pale, and hollow-eyed, beneath a buzzed cut that was growing back patchy. Me. I gripped the walker with both hands and took a deep breath. The nurse beside me gave an encouraging nod, but her eyes flicked toward the clock like she had somewhere else to be. The pain hit as soon as I shifted weight onto my left leg, a white-hot streak from my lower back down through my thigh. I clenched my jaw and kept moving. 1 step, 2, then I collapsed into the chair again, breath ragged. They used to call me Ironback in the field. I carried a 50-pound ruck across 20 miles of Afghan heat without blinking. Now I could barely manage 3 steps on linoleum. I sat still for a moment, sweat dripping into my eyes. Around me, other soldiers moved slowly through recovery routines. Most had visitors, wives, husbands, kids holding homemade cards. One man had his golden retriever brought in for morale. The dog licked his bandaged stump and made him laugh. My corner of the room was always empty. My father never came, not once. He sent a bouquet of red, white, blue carnations with a pre-printed military sympathy card. "Thank you for your service and sacrifice. Stay strong." It wasn't even signed. That night, I stared into the mirror in my hospital room. The person staring back had my eyes, but they didn't look like mine anymore. The enemy, it turned out, wasn't just overseas. It was my own body, my own family, the system I'd sworn to serve. The nights were the hardest. When the halls went quiet and the meds wore off, I sat in bed with my old military laptop. I logged in through secure credentials and typed in the report codes. "Access denied." I tried again with variations. "Access denied." My hands trembled, not from pain this time, but fury. I was there. I commanded that team. And now I couldn't even read the debriefs. Every attempt hit the same wall. Blacked out pages, redacted reports, or total lockout. The mission had been buried in red tape and labeled Classified National Security. So I did what I could. I opened a new notebook, one of those cheap spiral-bound ones from the hospital gift shop. Page 1. What I remember. I wrote everything: the terrain, the sequence of movements, the last known coordinates, the broken comms, the strange way our equipment glitched out before the ambush, the smell of burning canvas and blood, Ruiz's last joke before the sky turned to fire. My handwriting shook, but I didn't stop. This notebook would be my evidence, my memory, my weapon, because if they were going to silence me, they'd have to erase every word by hand. A few days later, I filed an official request for a hearing. That's when they sent in Hayes. Major Thomas Hayes had once served under me. He was younger then, green, nervous, always eager to impress. Now he wore captain's bars and the cold efficiency of someone climbing the chain. He walked in, holding a manila folder, barely a quarter-inch thick, and dropped it on my tray table. "This is the final review," he said flatly. "Operational failure due to unforeseen equipment malfunction. Case closed." I didn't look up from my notebook. "What malfunction?" He hesitated. "Guidance relay error." "Which contractor?" He smirked. "That's classified." I flipped open the report and ran my fingers over the black ink that covered whole paragraphs. "This is a joke," I said. "No, Lieutenant," he replied. "This is protocol." I finally met his eyes. He didn't flinch, but he didn't look comfortable either. "Your father signed off on this," he added. "Just so you know." I went still. Hayes tapped the file. "My advice: accept your commendation. Focus on healing. Let this go." I stared at him. "You know I won't," I said. He shrugged. "That's your choice, but you're out of moves, ma'am." He left the room. I sat in silence, my pen paused above the page. Then I wrote, "Hayes, first wall, there will be more." That night I lay awake, listening to the faint beeping of machines and the squeak of rubber soles on tile. The silence in between felt heavier than any battlefield I'd ever been on. I remembered Ruiz again. He was the loud one on our team, the guy who'd make terrible puns in life-or-death moments just to break the tension. He trusted me. They all did. And I brought them into a trap because of a faulty system no one wants to talk about. because someone made a call, maybe to cut corners, maybe to meet a deadline. And my team paid the price. But instead of answers, I was getting blank pages and stone faces. I opened the notebook again and turned to a fresh page. What they didn't tell us. And I kept going. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until the pain in my back flared, until the nurse dimmed the lights and told me to rest. But I didn't want rest. I wanted truth. And I knew in my gut that truth was buried under layers of protocol and cowardice. Layers built by people like Hayes, people like General Harris, people like my own father. The Serenity Prayer echoed in my head, not from church, but from a framed plaque that used to hang in my mother's kitchen. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I couldn't change what happened out there, but I could change what happened next, even if I had to do it alone. It started with a buzz, soft, barely noticeable. My personal phone, tucked deep inside the drawer by my bed, lit up for the first time in weeks. No one had that number. No one was supposed to. I pulled it out, expecting spam, or maybe a wrong number. But the message was chillingly specific. 15 Ag Bishop's Garden, National Cathedral. Come alone, tell no one. F. My heart pounded. F. I stared at the screen. It felt like something from an old Cold War spy novel. It could be a trap, a test, or a break in the deadlock that had closed around me like concrete. I told the nurse I needed air. She hesitated. You're not cleared for off-site mobility. I'm not asking, I said. Outside, I winced against the sharp spring air as I wheeled myself down the sidewalk. Every bump in the pavement jolted my spine, but I kept going, each push of the wheel whispering, almost there. The National Cathedral loomed in the distance, spires piercing the gray sky. I knew the Bishop's Garden well, quiet, shielded from the street, tucked between stone walls and hedges. It was the kind of place people went to mourn or pray, or apparently exchange secrets. He was already there. An older man in civilian clothes, sitting on a stone bench near the magnolia trees, square jaw, crisp posture despite his age. He didn't look up right away, but I recognized him, Admiral James Foster. I froze, a legend, decorated across 5 campaigns, the kind of man whose name got whispered in classified briefings. My father once said, when Foster walks into a room, generals shut their mouths. Now he was here, waiting for me. I wheeled closer, heart pounding. Lieutenant Laird, he said without turning, took you long enough. Sir? I tried to keep my voice steady. He finally looked at me. Sharp blue eyes. No warmth, just steel. You're digging where they told you not to. That takes either stupidity or conviction. I don't have the luxury of either, I said. Just memory. He nodded, then asked flatly, What evidence do you have? Aside from scars and a story your father called delusion, I took out the notebook, worn, coffee-stained, filled with handwritten maps and notes. I told him everything, the faulty comms, the unexplained interference, the redacted reports, the refusal to let me testify. I even mentioned Ruiz and the glitch that cost him his life. He said nothing, just watched. I'm not crazy, I said at last, and I'm not backing down. There was a pause, then a breath. Your father, he said slowly, was a good soldier, but he worships the uniform more than the truth. I blinked. He pulled something from his coat, a small black flip phone, burner style. This line is secure. Send everything you find. I can't promise victory, but I will fight. I took the phone. That should have been enough. But then he said something that made my throat tighten. Callahan was a friend of mine. He spoke of a cadet with a steel spine and a mind sharp as a blade. Said if he ever went to war again, he'd want her at his side. He paused. He wasn't wrong. The words knocked the breath out of me. Weeks of silence. Weeks of being gaslit, dismissed, sidelined, even by my own blood. And now, from a man I barely knew, came the one thing I needed most: belief. We sat in silence for a while, the magnolias swaying overhead. The garden was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I realized my fists were clenched in my lap. Slowly, I let go. When I finally spoke, my voice cracked. "Why are you helping me?" Foster looked out over the garden as if he were staring at ghosts. "Because truth matters, and because I've seen what happens when good soldiers are thrown away for the sake of convenience." He stood. "I'll be in touch." And just like that, he walked off, blending into the stone paths like a shadow. I didn't go straight back to the hospital. Instead, I wheeled myself around the cathedral grounds, letting the cold breeze sting my cheeks. For the first time in weeks, the pain felt like proof I was still alive. The last few weeks had flattened me, mind, body, identity. But this was a crack in the wall. Not wide enough to escape through, but just enough to let light in. I thought of Callahan's book, of Queen Boudica, of resistance that came not from numbers, but from sheer refusal to disappear. That night, back in my room, I opened a new page in my notebook, codename Foster. I recorded every word he said, his eyes, his tone, the way he tested me before offering a single ounce of support. He wasn't just risking his reputation, he was sticking his neck out for a woman branded a liability by her own command. That meant something, that meant everything. I stared out the window into the night sky. It was the same one I had stared at 1,000 times on deployment, trying to remember who I was outside the uniform. Now I wasn't sure who I was yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't alone anymore. And that changed everything. The common room smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. I was clumsily working through a new set of walking drills, each movement a negotiation with pain. The TV was on, low volume, flickering images above the fireplace. Then someone turned it up. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on The Patriot's Voice, we speak with decorated veteran Colonel Daniel Laird, whose daughter, Lieutenant Greta Laird, has been in the news lately for some controversial claims." I froze. The camera panned to him, my father, sitting upright in full uniform, posture flawless. The host leaned forward, voice syrupy. "Colonel, your daughter is a war hero, but she's made some troubling accusations regarding her last mission. What can you tell us?" My father looked directly into the camera. His tone was composed, but his eyes held that familiar, distant flatness. "My daughter is indeed a hero," he began. "She has served with honor, but war leaves wounds, many of them invisible. Greta is suffering from PTSD. She's vulnerable, and she's latching onto conspiracy theories that have no foundation in fact. What she needs right now is not attention, but healing." He paused. "We must protect our military institutions from false narratives, no matter how personal they seem." The screen faded to commercial, but I couldn't hear anything anymore. The room around me was still. All the soldiers, nurses, visitors, they were all looking at me, but not with admiration, with pity, with doubt. My knees buckled, and I had to grab the walker just to stay upright. Back in my room, the burner phone buzzed in my lap. "Foster," I answered with trembling fingers. "I saw it," he said. His voice was gravelly, tight. "They're playing dirty. Using your father was strategic. It's going to make this 10 times harder. I stayed silent. They're not just discrediting you, Greta. They're rewriting the narrative. Right now, you're not a whistleblower. You're a damaged daughter trying to take down her father's legacy. He didn't say he was giving up, but I heard the shift in his tone. Doubt. I hung up before I started crying. The walls of my room felt closer than ever. I tried to breathe, but every inhale caught in my throat like splinters. I threw open the bathroom cabinet, stared at the mirror. My face looked unfamiliar. Half-healed cuts, fading bruises, the deep-set lines from nights without sleep. And underneath it all, shame. Not for what I'd said, but for the way it had been twisted. I heard his voice again, echoing in my skull like a virus. She needs help. She's not well. PTSD. He used my scars as a weapon, my trauma as a prop. Not even the enemy had done that. I grabbed the glass of water on my tray and hurled it at the wall. It shattered instantly, shards flying everywhere, catching light like splinters of ice. I collapsed to the floor. No ranks, no titles, no mission, just me, crying into my knees, feeling like the war had finally won. Time blurred. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, maybe hours. Long enough for the room to go dark, except for the soft glow from the hallway. A nurse knocked. "Miss Laird, are you okay?" I didn't answer, couldn't. She opened the door, saw the broken glass, the soaked gown, the hollow look on my face. "I'll get someone to clean that up," she whispered, then gently shut the door again. Even she didn't ask if I was all right. They already believed what they saw on television. The words of a father, broadcast to millions, had more power than my truth, written in 100 pages of testimony. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. I thought of Foster, of how even he hesitated. I thought of the silence from others who once stood beside me. People I trained with, bled with, vanished behind locked doors. But mostly, I thought of my father. And for the first time, I didn't cry because he didn't believe me. I cried because I finally understood he never would. To him, I was never Greta. I was a soldier in his image, a reflection he could use as long as I behaved. And now I was a crack in his perfect mirror. He didn't try to fix the mirror, he shattered it, and made sure everyone saw the pieces. I sat up in bed, muscles screaming, and reached for the notebook again. I flipped past pages of diagrams and reports. I turned to a new page, tore off the old title, What I Remember, then wrote, What They'll Try to Erase. Because that's what this was now, a war of memory. And I was done hiding mine. Even if I had to scream it from the rubble they left me in, even if I had to bleed it onto every page. They thought they'd broken me. They were wrong. I closed the notebook and looked at the broken glass still glinting on the floor. Tomorrow they'd send in someone to sweep it up, as if nothing happened. But I'd remember the sound of it breaking, the way the world split with it. And when the time came, when they tried to bury the truth under medals and press releases, I'd hold up every shard of that glass and make them look at what they'd done. The silence after the glass shattered was deeper than anything I'd ever heard. I sat there, curled in on myself among shards, feeling like something inside me had cracked wide open. No alarms blared, no footsteps came running, just me, just the echo of betrayal, lingering in the stale air of that hospital room. And then, out of nowhere, a memory broke through the fog. I was 6, tucked beneath a quilt, cold feet brushing against my grandmother's legs as she read to me from her old, worn Bible. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Her voice was soft, unwavering, not theatrical, just steady, like a hand holding mine in the dark. I hadn't thought about that night in decades, but now the words rang inside me like steel on steel. I wasn't religious, not in any real sense, but those words didn't feel like scripture. They felt like a challenge. Walk through it. Don't fear it. I breathed in. The air hurt going in, like I'd been underwater too long. That's when the phone rang, the landline next to my bed. I answered with a mechanical motion, already knowing. Lieutenant Laird, Hayes's voice oozed down the line, polished and smug. Per orders from General Harris, and with support from your father, you are to be transferred to the secure psychological wing for further treatment. Effective immediately. My fingers clenched. You will relinquish all personal communication devices at the door, he added. We believe it's for your own well-being. They weren't just trying to silence me. They were trying to erase me. Hayes kept speaking, something about policy and protocol. I didn't hear it. The line in my mind was already drawn. They would not put me in a padded room and call it compassion. They would not medicate me into forgetfulness. They would not twist my grief into a diagnosis. I hung up without replying, and then I stood, slowly, unsteadily, using the wall and every ounce of will I had left. My body screamed in protest, but my mind was louder. I crossed the room to the mirror, cracked from where the glass had hit earlier. My reflection was split down the middle, as fractured as I felt. I looked at myself. The swollen eyes, the healing wounds, the woman everyone said was broken. And I whispered, no, you don't get to win. The rage didn't roar. It burned, low, controlled, focused. I turned, lifting the back of my hospital gown, just enough to see the faint map of scars on my back in the fractured reflection. I didn't flinch. They weren't shameful anymore. They were marks of survival. I stared at them and spoke, not to anyone present, but to the man who'd made me. Dad, I said quietly, you picked your side. My hand closed around one of the larger shards of glass on the floor. I pressed it into my palm, not enough to do real damage, just enough to feel pain, to feel something sharp, something alive. You chose uniform over truth, and I choose truth over blood, over silence, over the comfort of letting go. The sting grounded me, cleared my mind. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembering, about not letting them rewrite the story I lived through just because it made them uncomfortable. I grabbed the notebook, flipped to a new page, wrote in large block letters, "They tried to bury me." Then underneath, "But I remember where they stood." I smiled, just faintly. My body trembled, but my spirit didn't. The real war hadn't started yet, but I had. The transfer team would arrive at dawn. That gave me just hours. Hours to prepare, to write, to memorize every critical name, date, frequency, to ensure that even if they took the notebook, they wouldn't take the truth from my head. I reviewed my notes like it was a combat briefing, scribbled new observations in the margins, drew maps from memory, highlighted patterns I hadn't seen before, now sharpened through rage and clarity. And I sent one final encrypted text to the burner Foster gave me. "They're moving me. Psychiatric lockdown. I won't be reachable. Keep your eyes on Hayes. The truth is still intact." There was no reply, but I didn't need one. The next morning, I sat upright in bed when the orderlies arrived. 2 men in pale blue scrubs, gentle, neutral expressions. They expected resistance, or maybe sedation. I gave them neither. "I'll walk," I said. They looked confused. I said I'll walk, no chair. I took my steps slowly but deliberately. The pain was real, but it was mine. Every limp, every flinch was earned. They tried to shame my body into submission. Instead, I used it to make a point. I passed by the nurse's station. The young woman who'd helped change my dressings last week looked up. I caught her eye. She blinked. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. I nodded back. There were still witnesses, still people who saw what was happening, and I would not let them down. They led me to the double doors of the psychiatric unit. I took one last look back down the hallway, not out of fear, but as a soldier marks the terrain before battle. Then I walked in, head high, scarred, yes, but no longer silent. And maybe some of you listening have felt this too. That moment when the very people meant to protect you, to lift you, instead, tighten the chains around your silence. If you've ever sat in that dark whispering to yourself, "This isn't how my story ends," then you already understand why I stood back up. The moment Hayes hung up, I knew the clock had started ticking. They would come for me soon, probably with soft voices and clipboards, maybe even restraints hidden under folded linens. But I wasn't waiting. I reached for the burner phone Foster had given me. My fingers moved faster than my thoughts. I typed just 2 words, Plan B. Then I hit send. The message vanished into encryption. There was no turning back. I buzzed the nurse, Corinne. She'd been kind once, slipping me an extra blanket, offering silence when others poked too deep. I was gambling on that humanity still being there. When she walked in, I didn't speak immediately. I let her see the red in my eyes, the tension in my shoulders, the trembling lip that didn't need to be faked. "They're transferring me," I said, my voice cracking. "They think I'm not stable because I reacted to my father going on TV and throwing me to the wolves." Corinne hesitated. Her eyes darted to the hallway, then back to me. "I'm not asking for a pass," I whispered. "I'm asking for a phone call to a JAG attorney. It's my legal right before any psychiatric transfer. Please." She bit her lip. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Finally, she nodded. "I'll buy you 15 minutes. And just like that, I had my first win. 15 minutes was enough for Foster to do what he did best: leverage power quietly, precisely. By the next morning, the transfer was off. I wasn't told why, but I knew. Instead, a manila envelope was slipped under my door with no markings, except a single letter F written in pencil. Inside, a USB stick and a single printed page. David Chen, former lead systems engineer, recently terminated from Orion Systems. Underneath, a scribbled note. "Likes black coffee, the daily grind, 8:30 a.m. That was it. No more explanations, no more safety nets. I folded the page and tucked it into my cast. The USB went into the lining of my jacket, stitched there with trembling hands and a safety pin. That evening, I asked for physical therapy authorization. My vitals were strong, my mobility improving. Corinne signed off on a supervised outing. But when we reached the loading bay, I stepped back, let the elevator doors close, and vanished down the stairwell. Freedom had never smelled like diesel and cold concrete before. The metro took me to Georgetown. The coffee shop was tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner, brick-lined and nondescript. A place where people didn't look up from their laptops, just the way I needed it. At 8:35, he walked in. I recognized him immediately. The photo had been grainy, but the hunched posture and wary eyes were unmistakable. He ordered, sat near the window, alone. I approached slowly, slipped the USB onto his table. "They lied," I said softly. "They killed my team, and they lied about your system." David Chen stared at me. His face turned pale. For a moment, he looked like he might scream. Instead, he stood, grabbed his cup, and walked out. Not a word. I sat there for 10 more minutes, breath shallow, heart like a drumline in my chest. Then I left. Back at the hospital, I had no idea whether I'd failed or just played a losing hand. But that night, the burner buzzed once, an encrypted ping from Foster. It wasn't a message, it was an audio file. I played it with headphones on, under the covers like a child hiding a flashlight. At first, static, then a voice I knew too well. General Harris. Yes, there's risk in the guidance interface, but this contract is too important to delay. If something goes wrong, it'll be labeled an acceptable combat loss. It's the cost of progress. I froze. He had said it, out loud, in a room full of executives, and now I had the tape. Chen had sent it. His silence wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. He had waited until he could move safely, anonymously. I clutched the phone to my chest, breath stolen by a wave of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. It wasn't just my word against theirs anymore. Now there was proof. I transferred the file twice, stored backups, encrypted it in triplicate. The military had taught me paranoia, and tonight I embraced it. My tears came slow, not heavy, not dramatic, just the slow, steady kind that burn without sobbing. I wasn't alone in this. Someone had believed me enough to act. The next morning, Foster's text arrived. We strike soon. Rest while you can. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without seeing the blast, without hearing Ruiz scream. I was still broken, but now I had something stronger than anger. I had momentum. I woke just after dawn, sat upright in bed, and began preparing. The next phase wasn't just about revenge. It was about truth, justice, and reclaiming what had been stolen from my team. I sketched out timelines, listed names, mapped connections. The manila folder was now worn from handling, but it had become my tactical briefing binder. I wasn't acting on emotion anymore. I was planning a mission. They wanted me labeled, locked away, silenced. But thanks to David Chen and to Foster, I now had a key, a crack in the fortress, and I was going to blow it wide open. I walked into the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room like I was stepping onto a battlefield. The chamber smelled like old wood and polished steel. Cameras lined the walls. Every seat was filled. Staffers, reporters, officers in uniform, and civilians in suits. Directly across from me sat General Harris, the executives from Orion Systems, and my father, Colonel Laird. They all looked unbothered. Harris smirked. My father's jaw was tight, his posture perfect. They expected me to fold. The chairman opened with procedural notes. Then the Orion attorney launched in, his tone slick with mock concern. We recognize Lieutenant Greta Laird's service, but she's been diagnosed with PTSD, corroborated by military psychologists. Her own father, a decorated officer, expressed concern over her mental fitness. We empathize with her trauma, but trauma is not proof. I sat still. Then it was my turn. I adjusted the microphone. My voice came out quieter than I'd expected, but steady. I didn't come here to win sympathy, I said. I came here to tell the truth. I described the mission. The moment the guidance system froze mid-flight, the screaming on the radio, the smoke curling around us as we tried to regroup. I spoke of Ruiz's last breath, the way his hand twitched before going still. They called it a technical malfunction. I call it premeditated negligence. Harris shifted in his seat. My father stared straight ahead. The Orion lawyer laughed dryly. A moving story, Lieutenant, but do you have evidence beyond memories and scars? That was the cue. Foster, seated behind me, gave a subtle nod. My attorney stood. "Mr. Chairman, we do." He inserted a flash drive. The monitors flickered, and then the audio played. At first, just background chatter. Then the unmistakable voice of General Harris. "We're aware of the navigational risk, but this contract's too valuable to stall. If there's a casualty, we'll frame it as an acceptable loss." Silence fell like a guillotine. Harris's face drained of color. The Orion executives exchanged panicked glances. The chairman leaned forward, eyes narrowed. But I only looked at one person, my father. He didn't blink, but I saw it, the small flinch, the breaking of armor. For the first time, he saw me not as a soldier to control, but as a woman standing in defiance. And he knew he'd chosen the wrong side. The audio ended. The room stayed frozen. I stood, slowly, my legs burning beneath me. "Senators," I said, voice no longer soft. "They say I'm unstable because of invisible wounds. Then let me show you the visible ones." With trembling fingers, I undid my jacket. My lawyer helped me lower it. Gasps rose from the gallery as my back came into view, lined with long, jagged scars, raw, undeniable. These are not hallucinations. These are not figments of trauma. These are consequences of greed, of silence, of cowardice. I turned back to face them. I buried 6 good soldiers. I wake every night with their voices in my head. I was told to be quiet. I was told to take my medal and disappear. I won't. Harris looked like stone. The Orion execs stared at the floor. My father looked at his hands. That was the first time I ever saw him unsure. The committee recessed for deliberation. Reporters swarmed the hallway. I kept my eyes down, Foster shielding me from the barrage. We waited in a small conference room, lights dimmed, walls too thin to hold back the noise. Foster didn't say much. He just stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back. Finally, the door opened. A staffer stepped in, expression unreadable. "They're reconvening." I walked back in under the weight of 1,000 eyes. The chairman cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Laird, this committee thanks you for your candor. We have decided to open a formal investigation into Orion Systems conduct. Further, General Harris has been placed under immediate review by the Department of Defense." A beat passed, then applause, hesitant at first, then louder, not from everyone, but enough. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I just breathed. It was over. No, it had just begun. After the hearing, I sat alone on a bench outside the Capitol. The marble steps gleamed under afternoon sun. Tourists walked past, unaware that history had just cracked open inside. I pulled my coat tighter around me, felt the sting of scars beneath cotton. I thought of Ruiz, of Simmons, of every soldier who trusted the system that betrayed them. Today, I hadn't spoken just for me. I'd spoken for all of us. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "You weren't wrong. Thank you." No name, but I knew. Truth has a way of echoing, of finding corners we never imagined. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a victim. I was a soldier who told the truth. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As I rose from the bench outside the Capitol, a gust of wind lifted the collar of my coat. I turned to look back at the dome, glowing in the sun, and thought, this was just the first battle. There would be hearings, questions, more shadows to chase. But I had cracked the silence. Somewhere inside me, a voice I hadn't heard in years whispered, "Stand tall." And for once I did, without shame, without fear, because from now on, the truth would walk with me. The headlines screamed vindication. Whistleblower hero turns tide on defense giant. Orion investigated for criminal negligence. General Harris under review by DOD. But in my temporary apartment off DuPont Circle, surrounded by bland furniture and the sterile scent of new carpet, I felt only silence. Not peace, just a ringing emptiness, the kind that follows a long, deafening battle. My phone buzzed nonstop. Text after text, colleagues, reporters, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Some called me brave, others asked for interviews. Then came the voicemails, Mom sobbing, begging me to pick up, pleading for my forgiveness. Your father, he didn't mean to. He's hurting, Greta, please. I didn't answer. I needed silence more than closure. I needed to hear my own voice again, not everyone else's version of me. Because even though I had won, the hearings, the truth, the public, I had lost something that couldn't be reclaimed. I had lost my father. A few days later, a handwritten envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. I'd seen it on birthday cards, on military commendation reports, on post-it notes stuck to the fridge, reminding me to wake up for training runs. It was from him. The letter inside was short. Greta, I was wrong. I believed in a system that did not deserve it. I let pride guide me where love should have. You were right to speak up. I was wrong to doubt you. If there's any path back to you, I will take it, no matter how long. Dad. His penmanship was shakier than I remembered. Less like a commanding officer, more like a man whose hands couldn't stop the tremble of guilt. I stared at the letter for what felt like hours. Read it once, then again, and again. I cried. Not the tears of anger or relief, but grief. A mourning for what should have been. For the father I needed years ago. For the home that never really was. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone, call him, run to him. But home had always been conditional. His approval had always come with silence, with submission, with erasure of who I really was. Could I forgive him? Yes, eventually. Could I trust him again? No, that bridge had burned too hot, too completely. The letter went back into its envelope, tucked inside a drawer I didn't open often. A week later, I agreed to meet him. Neutral ground, a public park on the Potomac, just past the Kennedy Center, where the city gives way to trees and riverbanks. It was early evening, the sky pale orange. The air held that sharpness of spring turning to summer. He sat alone on a bench. I almost didn't recognize him. The man who once seemed too large for his own shadow now sat hunched, his frame smaller, more fragile. The crispness of his uniform gone. Civilian jacket, gray creeping fast at his temples. Greta, he said, rising slowly. I didn't let him speak further. I read your letter, I said, keeping my voice even. And I forgive you. His eyes watered, but he didn't interrupt. I forgive you not because what you did was okay, but because I don't want to carry this anymore. I need peace. But you have to understand, things won't go back to what they were. He nodded slightly, lips pressed tight. I can't let you back into my life right now, I continued. Maybe not ever, not because I don't love you, but because I do. And love, real love, has boundaries. Mine was crossed, repeatedly. A breeze stirred the leaves around us. He looked down at his shoes. I took a slow breath, looked out at the river. You were my hero, I said. All my life, I wanted to be seen by you. And now that I finally am, it's too late. That hurts, but I'll live with it. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to plead. I turned and walked away. And for the first time, I didn't look back. That walk from the park bench to the street was short, but it felt like crossing a continent. I had marched with weight on my shoulders before, packs heavier than my body, weapons slung at my side. But nothing ever weighed more than that goodbye. Back in my apartment, I sat alone. No reporters, no spotlights, no senators. Just me and the hum of the refrigerator. I opened my journal and began to write. Not for the committee, not for Foster, for me. I wrote about what it meant to speak up. What it cost to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it. What it meant to finally choose yourself, even if it means walking away from the people who gave you life. That night, I slept without nightmares. For the first time in months, I slept like a soldier who had finally laid down her weapon. Not in defeat, but in decision. The war for my truth was over, and I had survived. The next morning, I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight spill over the city's edge. Washington buzzed below. Horns, buses, lives rushing toward whatever mattered next. And yet I stood still, not because I didn't know where to go, but because I finally had the right to choose. For so long I'd been pushed by duty, pulled by expectation, shaped by a father's silence and a system's denial. Now there was just me, Greta Laird, veteran, survivor, truth teller. I wasn't whole, but I was real. And maybe for the first time, that was enough. A few months after the hearing, the world around me had changed. My proposal, backed fiercely by Admiral Foster, was officially adopted into military policy. They called it the Callahan Clause, a small nod to the professor who first saw in me something more than a uniform or a last name. The Callahan Clause created an independent reporting channel for service members, one that bypassed the chain of command and protected whistleblowers from retaliation. It wasn't flashy, it didn't make headlines for long, but it was real, and it would save lives, even if most people never knew it existed. When I got the news, I didn't celebrate. I just stood by my window in silence. Somewhere in the blue above the Potomac, I imagined Ruiz grinning, West clapping sarcastically, and Callahan sipping his black coffee. "We did it," I whispered. And for the first time, the air didn't feel heavy. Admiral Foster reached out soon after. He said there was an opening at the Naval Academy, a new course titled Ethics and Leadership in Modern Warfare. He said it was mine if I wanted it, not because I was a hero, but because I had survived, because I had something real to teach. I moved into a modest apartment just outside Annapolis. On my first morning there, I stood in front of the mirror, towel draped around my neck. For years, I had avoided mirrors, especially ones that showed my back. But this time I looked. The scars were still there, angry lines of trauma stitched across my skin. But they didn't burn anymore. They didn't whisper shame or weakness. They told the truth. They said, I had endured, I had fought, and I had lived. I touched one gently with my fingers. For the first time, I didn't wince. I didn't look away. I simply breathed. That was enough. On my first day teaching, I walked into the lecture hall wearing a black blouse and slacks, no uniform. The faces staring up at me were young, eager, unbroken. The same age I'd been when I thought courage came from medals and orders. "Good morning," I began. My voice didn't shake. "Today we're not going to talk about tactics or history. We're going to talk about courage. The kind that shows up when nobody's watching. The kind that tells the truth even when it costs you everything." About halfway through class, I noticed someone standing near the back. An older man in civilian clothes, silver hair, ramrod straight posture. I knew that silhouette by heart, my father. He didn't try to speak. He just stood there watching. His face was a quiet mix of sorrow and pride. For a moment, our eyes locked, And in that glance, I gave him all I had left to give, a small nod, no words, no promises, just a recognition that he was trying. That was all I could offer. I turned back to the class. I continued the lesson, not because I was trying to prove anything anymore, but because I believed in it, because they needed to hear it, because it mattered. That evening, I sat alone on the steps of the academic building, watching the last light fade behind the spires of Annapolis. I had walked through hell. I had lost people I loved. I had fought against giants, but I was still here, not because I was the strongest, but because I had decided not to stay silent. And now I could finally rest, because I had found my purpose, not in battle, not in revenge, but in guiding others to do what is right, no matter the cost. Later that week, I wandered the grounds of the Naval Academy alone, just as I had years ago as a cadet, boots clicking along the cobblestone walkways. The Chesapeake breeze still smelled of salt and promise. But this time, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I was walking beside ghosts who had already accepted me. Inside the chapel, I lit a candle, not for religion, but for remembrance. I sat in the back pew and closed my eyes. For Ruiz. For those whose names never made it into any report. For the younger version of me who thought surviving meant staying quiet. A voice broke the silence. "Ma'am?" I opened my eyes. A cadet stood nearby, tall, freckled, nervously shifting. "Your lecture," she said. "It made me think. My brother's in the infantry. If something ever happens, I want to be brave enough to speak." I smiled. "Then you already are." As she walked away, I felt something inside me settle. This wasn't just teaching, it was healing. Before heading home that evening, I passed by a small memorial wall on campus, etched names and stone flowers. I didn't look away this time. I stood before it with quiet pride. They had not been forgotten, and neither had I. The night before my first lecture, I sat with a stack of old letters, some from fellow soldiers, some I had never opened. One was from my mother. She wrote that she was proud of me, though she didn't understand everything. "Your strength," she said, "was never in your silence, Greta. It was in how you kept standing." I tucked it into my bag. It was time. I didn't know if I would stay at Annapolis forever. But for now it was where I needed to be, where I could rebuild not just my life, but the very idea of what service meant. So I stepped forward, not as a survivor clinging to the past, but as a woman who had finally made peace with it. And that peace, it was the real victory. If this story reminded you of someone you've had to walk away from to protect your peace, you're not alone. I lived it, and I'm still learning how to heal, one breath at a time. If my story touched you, consider subscribing to this channel. There are more voices like mine, stories of quiet courage, hard choices, and quiet victories. Leave a comment below. I'd love to know what helped you find your strength when the world turned its back.